It was the summer of 2013, and the world's most powerful intelligence agencies were panicking. The CIA and NSA were running around their office because a pale, lanky 29-year-old didn't show up for work. This guy had just left on sick leave, but with a backpack full of America's most explosive secrets, then had just vanished into thin air. And the moment he opened his mouth, the United States succumbed to chaos.
Of the man who sent the Obama administration.
No, the U.S. could then scramble jets to take it down.
It was either a patriot or
with the Edward Snowden case.
They frankly lied to us in open testimony in committee and said they weren't.
My name's Ed Snowden. I'm 29 years old. I work for Booz Allen Hamilton as an infrastructure analyst for NSA in Hawaii.
The chase began in Hong Kong, where Edward Snowden had been holed up in a luxury hotel, carefully leaking documents to journalists. When the U.S. government realized what was happening, they scrambled to stop him. Arrest warrants were issued. Diplomatic cables fired off. But Hong Kong, technically part of China but with its own legal quirks, played the perfect bureaucratic delaying game. "We need more paperwork," officials said, as Snowden quietly boarded a flight to Moscow. By the time U.S. officials realized he was gone, Snowden was already sitting in the transit zone of Moscow's Sheremetyevo airport, technically nowhere, legally untouchable. The CIA went into overdrive. They pressured airlines. They tracked flight manifests. They even reportedly considered extreme measures, like forcing down planes mid-flight. But Snowden stayed one step ahead, his location a carefully guarded secret even as his face dominated global headlines. Meanwhile, the world's intelligence agencies turned on each other. Russia, sensing an opportunity to humiliate Washington, toyed with the Americans. China, after letting him slip through their fingers, watched with quiet amusement. Ecuador initially signaled they might take him until the U.S. made it very clear that trade deals and diplomatic goodwill were suddenly on the line. The most absurd moment came when Bolivia's presidential plane was forced to land in Austria because of a false CIA tip that Snowden was on board. Soldiers stormed the jet, only to find a very confused President Evo Morales and no Snowden. The global backlash was instant. Latin American leaders erupted in fury, and Snowden, still tweeting from his airport limbo, became an even bigger symbol of U.S. overreach. So Latin America was pissed. Hong Kong was secretly amused. Ecuador was indecisive. Russia was enjoying the show, and America was on the verge of a mental breakdown, all because of one man. So the question is, why? Edward Snowden wasn't born a rebel. In fact, he started out as the kind of kid you'd expect to become the system's perfect cog. Born in 1983 to a Coast Guard officer and a federal court clerk, he grew up in the shadow of NSA headquarters, literally. His childhood home was just miles away from the very agency he would later dismantle. The irony wasn't lost on him. As a teenager, Snowden was more interested in computers than classes. He dropped out of high school but aced tech certifications, the kind of move that makes guidance counselors cringe and Silicon Valley recruiters drool. By 20, he was working as a security guard at a covert NSA facility, because what better way to learn about government secrets than to stand around guarding them? His big break came in 2006 when the CIA, desperate for tech-savvy recruits, handed him a badge and a ticket to Geneva. There, Snowden got a front-row seat to the kind of spy games that would make Jason Bourne raise an eyebrow. He watched as CIA agents blackmailed a Swiss banker into becoming an informant, not with guns or threats, but with the kind of bureaucratic pressure that makes you question whether you're working for the good guys. They got the Swiss banker drunk and encouraged him to drive home. When he was arrested, the CIA operatives offered to help in exchange for him becoming an informant. Snowden played along, climbing the ranks with stints at Dell and Booz Allen Hamilton, where he landed a decent job as an NSA contractor. The pay was great, the access was better. And the moral dilemmas? Well, those piled up like unread terms and conditions agreements. Then came the breaking point. In 2013, while working in Hawaii, Snowden stumbled upon PRISM, the NSA's backdoor into the servers of Google, Facebook, and Apple. It wasn't just spies being spied on. It was everyone. Teachers, grandparents, that one guy who still uses AOL. The US government was vacuuming up data like a Roomba on steroids, and Snowden was one of the few people who knew it. Explicit photos that were meant for only boyfriends were passed around the office like candy. In Snowden words, in the course of their daily work, they stumble across something that is completely unrelated in any sort of necessary sense. For example, an intimate nude photo of someone in a sexually compromising situation. But they're extremely attractive. So what do? They turn around in their chair and they show a coworker. And sooner or later this person's whole life has been seen by all of these other people. Some NSA agents also spied on their own love interests, a practice NSA employees termed loviant. So he did what any reasonable person would, report all these cases to the higher-ups. He sent dozens of emails, but well, what would you expect? All his claims were reluctantly dismissed. Some were called fringe benefits for the operatives. So now he did what the average Joe wouldn't think of doing. He copied 900,000 plus files of classified documents, told his boss he needed medical leave, and fled to Hong Kong with the thumb drive. Because if you're going to blow the whistle on the most powerful surveillance state in history, you might as well do it from a luxury hotel with room service. The rest, as they say, is history, or at least a very awkward chapter in US intelligence. Snowden didn't just leak documents, he dropped a truth bomb that sent shockwaves from Berlin to Beijing. The first explosion came in June 2013, when journalists Glenn Greenwald and Laura Poitras published their initial revelations in The Guardian. These two were the journalists he had been contacting for over 6 months under different code names till he decided to meet them in person in Hong Kong. The headline said it all: NSA collecting phone records of millions of Verizon customers daily. Overnight, Americans learned their government was tracking every call they made, not just suspects, not just terrorists, but their own citizens. The program, codenamed PRISM, was the ultimate overreach, a direct pipeline into the servers of Google, Facebook, Microsoft, and Apple. The tech giants played dumb, but the evidence was undeniable. The NSA had turned Silicon Valley into its personal spy tool. Then came the international fireworks. In Germany, Chancellor Angela Merkel nearly choked on her schnitzel when she learned the NSA had been tapping her personal cell phone. The White House scrambled to explain why they were spying on an ally, because nothing says trust like secretly listening in on a world leader's gossip sessions. Meanwhile, in Brazil, President Dilma Rousseff discovered the NSA had been monitoring her emails. She canceled a state visit to Washington and delivered a blistering speech at the UN, accusing the US of violating international law. The diplomatic fallout was so bad that President Obama had to personally call her to smooth things over. Spoiler, it didn't work. But the real kicker? The leaks revealed the NSA wasn't just spying on their enemies, it was hacking everyone. China's universities, France's businesses, and even the European Union's internal communications. The agency had turned global surveillance into an Olympic sport, and they were going for gold. Of course, the US government tried to downplay it all. It's not technically surveillance, they argued. It's just collecting data in case we need it later. Right, and a tiger isn't technically dangerous until it bites your face off. It didn't stop there. The leaks kept causing a surge of anxiety for the US and everyone else. I mean, he did take over 900,000 files, containing everything the NSA didn't want you to see. Xkeyscore, a program that lets analysts search every email, chat, and browsing history without a warrant. Turbine, a system that infected millions of computers with malware, because why ask for permission when you can just hack the planet? Boundless Informant, a tool that maps out global surveillance in real time, like Google Earth for spies. One of the scariest things was that they could access any of your devices, even when they are turned off, to either listen or watch you in real time. Each revelation was worse than the last, and Snowden wasn't done. He handed over documents proving the NSA had tapped fiber optic cables, intercepted laptops in transit, and even impersonated Facebook servers to steal data. The world reacted with a mix of outrage and helplessness. Some countries, like Germany and Brazil, pushed for stricter privacy laws. Others, like Russia and China, used the leaks as proof that America was the real villain. And the US, they doubled down on their lies, insisting it was all for national security. But the damage was done. Snowden's leaks didn't just expose the NSA, they shattered the illusion of privacy in the digital age. Governments could no longer pretend they weren't watching. Corporations could no longer claim they weren't complicit. And ordinary people? They finally realized their emails weren't just between them and God. For all the good Snowden's revelations did, they also handed the bad guys a playbook. Within months of the leaks, ISIS and other terrorist groups were studying them like college kids cramming for finals. They ditched vulnerable communication channels, switched to encrypted apps like Signal and Telegram. The CIA wasn't happy. One former operative grumbled, "We went from seeing everything to seeing nothing overnight." Thanks, Ed. Suddenly, terrorists who'd been lazy with their OPSEC were now paranoid tech experts. The agency's prized surveillance programs, effectively neutered. And the worst part, Snowden had known this would happen. In his own words, he'd warned that exposing these tools would burn them forever. Meanwhile, in Washington, officials were trying to contain the damage. The NSA's credibility was in tatters. Tech companies were furious, and the government's carefully crafted narrative about targeted surveillance had been exposed as a lie. But instead of admitting fault, they doubled down. Obama called for reforms while quietly expanding surveillance powers. Congress held dramatic hearings where officials twisted themselves into pretzels trying to explain why spying on grandma's phone calls was essential for national security. Then came the smear campaign. Suddenly, every talking head on TV was painting Snowden as a reckless narcissist who had blood on his hands.
Ed Snowden, traitor or patriot? He says breaking the law was his only option.
Edward Snowden is a coward, he is a traitor, and he has betrayed his country.
He should be put on trial. He should be convicted because he's a guilty traitor. He deserves to be shot.
There's a lot of talk about whether or not Brian Williams asked him the toughest questions.
Your guest just said a whistleblower should be shot and killed. And you didn't ask any follow-up question.
Well, I didn't get to watch the whole interview. I mean, I know.
Stop. If you did not watch the whole Snowden interview, you should not be opining about Snowden on television.
This guy said it best. The media flip-flopped between hailing him as a hero and condemning him as a traitor. While the government hyperventilated about terrorists, they ignored the real threat Snowden had exposed. The same tools used to track jihadists were also being used to monitor activists, journalists, and ordinary citizens. The system wasn't broken. It was working exactly as designed. And then something funny happened. Instead of rolling over, the world pushed back, hard. Tech giants, terrified of losing customer trust, went into damage control mode. Apple and Google rolled out end-to-end encryption. Facebook begrudgingly tightened its privacy settings. Even Microsoft, long cozy with the government, started telling the NSA to back off. The era of Silicon Valley's blind cooperation was over. In Europe, the backlash was nuclear. Germany launched a parliamentary investigation. Brazil drafted sweeping internet privacy laws. The EU slapped the US with data-sharing restrictions that cost American companies billions. Even US courts couldn't ignore the fallout. In 2020, a federal appeals court dropped a bombshell. The NSA's mass phone surveillance program had been illegal all along. The ruling cited Snowden's leaks as proof. It was the ultimate irony. The whistleblower they'd branded a criminal had just won in court. But the real revolution was quieter. Ordinary people finally understood their digital lives weren't private. Encryption apps like Signal saw downloads skyrocket. VPNs went mainstream. A generation that had blindly clicked agree on terms of service suddenly cared about digital rights. Snowden, watching from Moscow, must have smirked. The surveillance state was still there, but now it had to work harder. So what exact charges would the US place on a law-abiding citizen who just wanted to expose the truth to the world, you may ask? Well, on June 14, 2013, a legal storm erupted in a sealed courtroom in Virginia as the U.S. Department of Justice targeted Snowden with a barrage of charges that felt like a script ripped from a Hollywood blockbuster. The accusations were grave: theft of government property, unauthorized communication of national defense secrets, and willful disclosure of classified intelligence under the Espionage Act. Each charge loomed large, threatening decades behind bars, framing Snowden not as a whistleblower, but as an enemy of the state for shining a light on the NSA's sprawling surveillance operations. The venue was no coincidence. Virginia's Eastern District has a staggering 97% conviction rate for Espionage Act cases, a veritable fortress for national security prosecutions. It was also home to Booz Allen Hamilton, the company that employed Snowden, assuring a jury pool steeped in loyalty to the intelligence community. The government's strategy was clear: crush dissent with a legal hammer. When this indictment struck, Snowden was in his Hong Kong hotel room. When he landed in Russia, the charges of being a Russian spy were almost added to the list, but Snowden weaved himself out of that one, saying he did not carry any of the 900,000 files he stole. He only landed with his principles. His principles didn't help him make it on that plane to Russia, though, but a very famous fellow whistleblower, Julian Assange of WikiLeaks, and some officials in Hong Kong. Hong Kong officials stopped the U.S. operatives that were trying to get into the city to arrest Snowden, saying they cited technical deficiencies in the U.S. paperwork, buying time in an elaborate game of cat and mouse. Behind the scenes, Beijing, though outwardly silent, seemed to encourage the delay. Why hand over a whistleblower who just unearthed American hypocrisy? By the time the US scrambled to fix its errors, Snowden was boarding a flight to Moscow, protected by Sarah Harrison, WikiLeaks' legal defense and Julian Assange's closest advisor, just as the wheels of Washington's wrath began to churn. At Sheremetyevo Airport's Terminal F in Russia, Snowden found himself in an unexpected purgatory, a brightly lit limbo where the absurd met the geopolitical. For 40 long days, he endured the confines of the transit zone, a legal gray area while the US and Russia engaged in a tense, high-stakes standoff. Rumors swirled about CIA schemes to intercept him, sabotaging flights, waylaying him during a layover, even revoking landing rights. When the US revoked his passport, trapping him in Moscow, Putin simply shrugged and responded, "If he wants to stay, that's his choice." By August 2013, Russia had seen enough of the farce and granted Snowden temporary asylum, a calculated middle finger to Washington that elevated him to the status of geopolitical pawn and unlikely folk hero. The US response volleyed between outrage and helplessness. President Obama, admitting that no jet-scrambling rescue mission was on the horizon, tried to downplay the embarrassment, quipping,
I'm not going to be scrambling jets to get a 29-year-old hacker.
masking his frustration with nonchalance. Fast forward to 12 years later, the charges still loom ominously. Now a Russian citizen with a family, Snowden tweets about encryption and civil liberties. The Espionage Act, a relic from the paranoia of World War I, remains a blunt weapon against truth-tellers.
You can go back to the Pentagon Papers with Dan Ellsberg and others who stood and went to the court system of America and made their case.
This was the Secretary of State John Kerry calling Snowden a coward for not standing trial, mentioning names like Daniel Ellsberg. But first, let's hear from Daniel himself to see if he really got a fair trial against the Espionage Act.
That appeared in my own trial 43 years ago, and that was the very first prosecution of any American for giving information to Americans. That my trial demonstrated that I was not allowed, by the nature of the charges against me under the Espionage Act, to describe my motives, my reasons, the considerations that had led me to break my promise that I'd made to the government many times not to reveal their secrets. I wasn't able to tell the jury that I regarded those secrets as wrongful, unconstitutional, wrongfully withheld. I wasn't able to say anything about that, or why I felt that it was reasonable for me to risk my life in this circumstance, as I had done earlier in the Marine Corps and elsewhere in Vietnam, but to risk my life to get these truths to the American people. Snowden wouldn't have any chance to say any of those things, the sort of things that he said to Brian Williams. He couldn't say those to a jury. The prosecutor would say, objection, irrelevant, as in my case. And under the current terms of the Espionage Act, the judge would have to agree. That's why the Espionage Act needs to be rescinded as applied to leakers. It was never meant to be applied to whistleblowers, as President Obama has now done 7 times. It's not designed for that, and it's unconstitutional.
Two different things are implied here, but they will never accept they are in the wrong. Snowden wasn't going to get justice, even if he tried. Yet, Snowden's impact is undeniable. His revelations ignited essential reforms, albeit modest, inspired a generation of activists, and shattered the myth that democracies don't engage in surveillance against their own citizens. The final twist in this saga? The very surveillance state that hunted him now operates with fewer checks than ever. But the world knows its face, thanks to the man who insisted that sunlight is the best disinfectant. Snowden's leaks were a paradox. They armed enemies but freed citizens. They exposed hypocrisy but sparked change. And while he's branded a traitor in America, to millions, he's the man who proved Big Brother was real and made the world fight back.
At the same time, you have to make a determination about what it is that's important to you. And if living unfreely but comfortably is something you're willing to accept, and I think many of us are, it's the human nature. You can get up every day, you can go to work, you can collect your large paycheck for relatively little work against the public interest and go to sleep at night after watching your shows. But if you realize that that's the world that you helped create, and it's going to get worse with the next generation and the next generation who extend the capabilities of this sort of architecture of oppression, you realize that you might be willing to accept any risk. And it doesn't matter what the outcome is, so long as the public gets to make their own decisions about how that's applied.